Can leaders of the G7 economies further tighten the screws against Russia as it continues its war against Ukraine? One possibility under discussion as the group meets this week in Germany, a price cap for Russian oil, in which major economies act together as a kind of buyer's cartel to fix prices. It's a measure that would work best if other major economies participate, such as India. But Delhi has had other ideas when it comes to Russian oil.
The EU is trying to wean itself off Russian oil as part of its sanctions against the Kremlin. But other countries are happy to fill the void. With demand for Russian oil falling, India was able to obtain a huge discount. It has increased its oil imports from Russia substantially since the invasion of Ukraine. India currently imports 600,000 barrels of oil from Russia each day, according to Kepler Analytics. That's up from 90,000 barrels a year ago. The share of Russian oil in India's imports has surged to 25%. In India, Russian crude oil is refined into gasoline and diesel and then sold abroad. This makes India one of the biggest beneficiaries of the sanctions against Russia.
All right, DW political correspondent Julia Saldelli joins me now from Garmisch-Partenkirchen. That's the site of those G7 meetings. Hi there, Julia. India is present in some of these discussions that are beginning today. How important is its role and the role of other emerging economies in the G7 plans?
Well, the G7 has traditionally been criticized for not really being inclusive with emerging economies like India, for example. And in this year's G7, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz really wanted to put the focus on some of these countries and invited them here to be guests and hold talks together. Now, the topics that are going to be covered, for example, energy, climate, and health, are all issues that the G7 leaders are aware that can't really be tackled by the G7 leaders alone. There has to be cooperation with these big emerging economies around the world to really be able to achieve results worldwide. And the fact that these countries have also been invited to the G7 comes to show that the leading economies and democracies in the world are aware of the importance and increasing importance that countries like India or South Africa or even Senegal are gaining in the world economy.
These G7 meetings follow a series of meetings between emerging economies and Russia, Brazil, India, China, South Africa among them. Is there a sense that both sides in this case, that is Russia and the nations that are trying to stop its war in Ukraine, that they're trying to woo these emerging economies, or is that too simple?
No, that is the impression that emerges from these opposing meetings almost, because we see on one side Russia trying to keep the BRICS countries on its side and trying to offer support to them, but also to receive their support on the other side. And then the G7 trying to also keep countries like India or Brazil on its side, also because if we look at India buying so much Russian oil after the war in Ukraine started, these countries have the potential to help Russia out of the sanctions and to keep the Russian economy afloat, and substituting almost the kind of economic relations that Russia previously had with G7 countries and especially also European countries. So it is in the interest of the G7 to keep these countries on their side, and but they also have taken a look at developing countries. Yesterday, the G7 countries announced that they are pledging $600 billion in investment projects in developing countries in an effort to challenge China's Belt and Road Initiative, the huge investment projects that China is also carrying out in developing countries to try to keep these countries out of the risk of falling into a debt trap with China, and China asserting too much political and economic influence there.
Okay, so it's in the interest of G7 economies to bring these emerging economies in particular into the fold when it comes to applying pressure on Russia. What kind of leverage do they have?
Well, on the one hand, already the fact that they are offering a seat at the table is important. It is important for these emerging economies to be taken seriously and to have a voice in important decisions that will go and impact their population too. the G7 countries also have to convince emerging economies that their values and their plan for the future are in their interest too. When we look, for example, at the fight against climate change, democracies in the G7 have to convince the emerging economy that their plan to invest more in renewables and try to slowly abandon fossil fuels is something that is worth pursuing. And also, they have to, in their mind, try to keep these countries further away from the orbits of Russia, but also of China, which they see now not only as a competitor, but as a challenger.
And Julie, we have to ask you about inflation. It's a major issue across G7 economies. What kind of specter is that playing in these discussions?
Well, leaders, including German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, have said yesterday that inflation and a looming economic crisis are of great concern. Now, the issue is that they have to try to strike a balance, for example, between punishing Russia for its attack against Ukraine, but also not punishing their own economies with the sanctions that they apply to Russia. And it is a difficult balance to strike. Now, the cap on oil prices could be a win-win situation where they find a solution that damages Russia's economy, but also tries to reduce the price burden on the people in G7 countries. But there is definitely concern that especially next winter could be a difficult one with increasingly expensive energy prices that are likely to hit.
All right. DW's Julia Saldelli and Garmisch Partenkirchen walking us through those G7 discussions. Thank you.